Okay, so let's get rolling here. We're running a few minutes behind, more than a few minutes, I guess. We're running about half an hour behind, unfortunately, but that's all right. We've still got time to get rolling. So first things first, before we get going, go ahead and fire up brackets or your preferred code editor, and we're going to follow along here with a series of there's 3 videos. It's Danny Crossing, our Danish friend. And we're going to start talking about object-oriented PHP. Okay? Now, so far, we've really talked about PHP in kind of a... I don't really know how... Okay, so there are a lot of things you can do in, like, say, Python, right? That you could do either as a class/object, or you could do it some other way, right? And you may have heard me say before that Python, in the eyes and views of most programmers, please put your Game Boy down and pay attention to what I'm talking about. And once you start thinking about Python in an object-oriented way, you really start to see that Python, especially when we move on to C#, that Python is not really an object-oriented language, right? It's intended to teach you what a loop looks like, what variables are, and things like that, right? You can make classes, and certainly we did that in 120, and you can certainly do that with Python, but it's not really what Python was intended to do. In fact, that's why Ruby exists. Is Motz, the guy that created Ruby, looked at Python and he said, you know, it's okay, but it's not quite as object-oriented as I would like for it to be. And so he created Ruby. Well, that brings me to my point for today. We're going to start talking about the idea of classes and objects as they apply to PHP. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, why in the world would we even do that? What is the purpose? Like, if you think about the things that we've used PHP for already, you're probably thinking like, well, why would you even use classes or objects? What would be a scenario? Well, what if instead of, okay, so what are the 2 things? Somebody raise your hand if you know the answer. What are the 2 things that make up a class or an object? Right? There are 2 things that I always say this: classes/objects have something and something. What are those 2 things? Okay, so there are things that describe what they are, what they look like, and those are called, or, you are correct, but or it's a P word, or, it's okay if you don't remember, we're going to talk about here in a minute, properties, right? And what's the other thing? It's what they can do, which are also called functions or methods. Very good. Now, specifically in context of PHP, we're going to, and Danny definitely is going to refer to them as properties and methods, or attributes and methods, okay? And so what if you, instead of having, remember how we did a database connection and we had different variables? One was called like database name, one was called like database like password or whatever, all those different things. But what if we could build like error checking into it? So like if we can't connect to the database for some reason, it echoes out some kind of, hey, that didn't work or something, right? We could do that without objects and classes and PHP, but man, is it easier if you use them, okay? So if you have, if everybody could make sure that your preferred text editor is or brackets, whatever you want to use, is fired up, just follow along. Don't worry about launching XAMPP, okay? I mean, go ahead if you want to. And if you are going to launch XAMPP and actually try to execute this code, make sure that the files are located in your htdocs folder within XAMPP, otherwise it won't run properly, right? And just follow along with what he's doing. Again, if you choose not to run XAMPP and actually execute the code, you still should be able to follow along. Okay, so let's start talking about how to create classes in an object-oriented way, or an object-oriented PHP, okay? So hopefully this makes a little more sense to people, and this makes what PHP can do a little more obvious to everybody, if that makes sense. Okay, So without further ado, let's hop over here and watch this first video. Please follow along as closely as you possibly can. If you need me to pause or back up or go over anything a second time, I would be more than happy to do so. Just raise your hand and let me know. All right, let's hop over here. The name of the video is Create Classes in OOP PHP, so Object Oriented Programming PHP. It's part of a larger playlist called like Object Oriented PHP or something like that by Danny Crossing, DANIKROSSING. Danny Crossing is the guy's name. If you'd like to have access to those videos later on. All right, let's check this out.
Today we're going to start actually coding something inside Object-Oriented PHP programming. So as you guys can see right in front of me here, I have a very basic index page with basic HTML5 code. And we talked about in one of the previous episodes that when we do actually do object-oriented programming, we don't code the code directly where we need to use it. That's what we call procedural programming, which is one we've done in one of the previous lessons or previous courses I did on PHP. In this series, we're going to do object-oriented programming, meaning that I'm actually going to go ahead and open up a new document where all the code containing, the object-oriented code is going to be saved inside of. So after opening up a new document, I'm going to go ahead and save it inside my root folder. I'm actually going to go ahead and include a separate folder for all my object-oriented files. So I'm going to say new folder. I'm going to call this one includes.
Now, I would recommend you do this. You're not required to. You may just have them all in one root folder if you so choose. But just like when you're doing regular web development and you have a folder for CSS and a folder for JavaScript and a folder for images and maybe a folder for videos and other things like that, it just makes a lot of organizational sense, as you may recall from what we talked about in 120, to divide everything up into these nice little neat folders, okay? Now, just as a quick little kind of unrelated sidebar, folder organization is really, really important. I would say I'm probably the world's worst to like think in the moment, oh, I don't need to organize any stuff, I'll just do it later. Do you know what the problem with I'll just do it later is? Yeah, later never comes. Later never ever happens. And so I always like to organize everything. Now, specifically with PHP, it's a good idea to do it just because, especially if you're doing it from an object-oriented perspective, you're going to be including a lot of things. And so it just makes sense to make sure that they're in their own separate little subdirectory. Now, one other thing, if you do not use this includes folder, if you just put everything in one main folder, just remember when you see him type, // to get up and then go down in the includes folder, you don't need to do that. You just need to type / like the name of the file, or what, does that make sense? So if anyone has any questions about that later on, we'll address that then.
And you guys can call whatever you want. You could also just save it inside the main part of your root folder. I'm going to go ahead and put it inside an includes folder. So inside this folder, I'm going to go ahead and save the file as new class.inc.php. Now again, you guys could just call it new class.php. The .inc does nothing other than just the name of the file. I like to put inc inside my files because it's inside an includes folder. So don't get confused about me putting inc inside my actual file name. So now that I created the name, I'm going to go ahead and save the file like so. And now we have a completely separate file just for the object-oriented code. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my PHP code inside this file here. I'm going to go ahead and just go down a few lines. And now we can actually go ahead and get started creating these classes that we need to use inside object-oriented programming. Now, when it comes to a class, it's basically a big object that contains a lot of different information, such as variables and functions, regarding one thing. For example, we could have a class called user, which has all the information regarding the users, such as the variables and the functions that might be related to users. Now, when it comes to object-oriented programming, we don't call these variables and functions anymore. We actually call it something called properties and methods. Now, they're not entirely the same as variables and functions, but they're very similar. So I'm just going to go ahead and say they're very similar to these variables and functions, even though they're called properties and methods. So inside this document, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create a new class. So I'm going to go ahead and say we have a class, which is just written like so, pretty simple. Now, when we want to name the class, a typical thing to do for programmers when it comes to class names is to start with a big letter. So in this case, just because I have to name it something, I'm just going to go ahead and call this one new class. You guys could call it whatever you want. I'm just going to go ahead and give it this name. After we give it a class name, we're going to go ahead and open up the curly brackets. Now, inside the curly brackets is where we're going to put all these properties and methods that are related to the class. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a comment here that says properties and methods goes here. So now we have a class that actually has a name, and we have a place we can actually put the properties and methods. The next thing we need to do is talk about how we actually access stuff inside the class. Because this class is going to have a lot of information, but if we can't actually get the information and show them inside the website, then it becomes pretty much useless if we can't actually get the information. So what I'm going to go ahead and do here, so I'm going to go ahead and go underneath the class, which is down here, and I'm going to go ahead and do something we call instantiating a class, which basically means that we're creating some kind of object that contains all the information regarding the class. The way we do that is by creating some kind of variable. I'm just going to go ahead and call this one objects, because this is what we call an object when we do actually instantiate a class. I'm going to set it equal to new space, and then the name of the class we have up here called new class. So I'm just going to copy it, paste it down here, and close.
Okay, now as you may be noticing, other than the $ being the symbol that indicates that we're creating a variable, right? The $, like in other languages, we just write the name of the variable in any kind of like symbol that indicates that. But in this we do. Other than that, though, this looks pretty much like how you create a class or create an object in C#, right? And JavaScript. It's pretty much the same thing. We've got that new keyword, we have the name of the class, the semicolon, etc. Right? So nothing completely brand new.
Close it off. So now we instantiated the class by creating an object. And now we can actually get access to all the properties and methods we have inside the class when we do actually call on this object here. Now, just to show you guys what exactly is inside this class, what we can do is after we instantiated this class by creating an object, is we can actually go ahead and go underneath our object and print out everything we have inside the class, just so we can actually see what's in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and use a function called var_dump, parentheses, semicolon, and I'm going to put the object inside the actual parentheses. So now that we have this, we should get all the information from the class. If I go back to the website, right now I'm inside the index page, which we haven't really started yet. So I'm going to go ahead and go up into my URL, go inside my includes folder, and then go into new class.inc.php. And let's actually make sure we spell that correctly, like so. And as you guys can see, we now have a object called new class. And right now we have nothing inside the actual object. So this is how it looks like when it's completely empty. I'm just going to go and zoom in for you guys so you can actually see. This is how it looks like when it's completely empty. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go inside my class, and just to show you guys an example, I'm going to go ahead and create a property. Now I'm going to go ahead and do something that we haven't talked about yet, which is I'm going to declare a public property. Again, if we can actually spell that correctly, so I'm going to say public. I'm going to give it a name by creating a variable. I'm going to say
here in just a mere moments, we're going to talk about public and all that kind of stuff, the other scope modifiers like that. But what would you probably assume that the public keyword means? Yeah, everything has access to it, exactly. Does anyone remember what the other two are? And? No. Public and global are interchangeable. They mean the same thing. Public, private, and it's one that we almost never use, but I do mention it from time to time. So you meant it, huh? No, protected. They're all three P words: public, private, and protected. Protected, all you really need to understand about it is it's identical to public. Well, actually it's identical to both of them. The idea is that like a private method can only be accessed from within that same class. A public method can be accessed from anywhere, and a protected method can be accessed only from within a class or classes derived from that class. Remember when we talked about parent and child classes? We'll talk about more about inheritance later on. Remember when we talked about the idea that you could have like person, right? And then from that you could have a student class and a teacher class, right? That like inherit things from the person, but each have unique things. Like, you know, is tenured, would be something that a teacher would have, but not a student. Is on academic probation or something like that, is enrolled, would be something a student would have, right? And then there'd be things like names that both of them would have. That's what protected is. So anyway, don't worry about it too much right now. I just wanted to quick refresher on that.
Say info. I'm going to set it equal to a string called this is some info. Like so. So if I go back inside the browser, you guys will notice that now we do actually see that we have some information inside this class. So this is how we can actually get started creating classes. This is how we can put stuff inside the class. In the next episode, we're going to talk about what exactly this public means and talk about some of the other things we can put in front of our properties and methods when it comes to public, private, and protected.
Okay, so there's that. Now let's actually talk about what I mentioned a moment ago, visibility and inheritance. Now there's a little bit in this video that covers methods and properties in a little more detail. It talks about it at least. We're not actually going to cover that until the third and final video that we're watching today. But just as a heads up, if he talks about some stuff that you're like, we haven't discussed that yet, don't worry, we will. Just type what he says and we'll take care of all that here in just a minute. All right, so let's check out the next video.
So in the last episode, you learned how to create classes inside object-oriented PHP. And in this episode, we're going to talk about something called visibility and inheritance. Now, it's going to be kind of weird because I can't talk about visibility without also talking about properties and methods, which is not something I'm going to teach until the next episode. And I can't talk about properties and methods in the next episode without also talking about visibility because they kind of go together. So I'm going to talk about both in this episode. I'm mainly going to focus on visibility and inheritance here. So if you have any questions about properties and methods, just go ahead and watch the next episode and see if you still have any questions there. So as you can see in front of me here, I have a couple of different documents. I have a index page and I also have a class page. Inside the class document, I have two different classes. I have a person class and I have a pet class. And I don't think I mentioned this in the previous episode, but it is possible to put multiple classes inside one document. It's not the best way to do things, but it is possible. So just for the sake of this exercise here, I just went ahead and took two classes, put them inside one document so it's easier to see. But what I want you to get from this is that we have two classes, and inside these classes we have some data, we have some properties inside the first class up here, which is person. A property is kind of similar to a variable. It's not the same thing, but the best way I can describe it is that it's kind of like variables inside an object, if I had to say it in some kind of way. Again, it's not the same thing. I will get hate in the comments if I say they're the same thing. They're not. But again, for new people, they're kind of like variables. If we were to go down inside my pet class, you can see we have not a function, because again, I will get hate if I say that, but I have a method, which is kind of similar to a function, okay? Now, the idea here is that from inside the index page, I want to echo out the method down here. And right now, as you can see inside the method, I have a variable that is set equal to hi there, and I simply return variable a. So with this method here, what I can do is I can go inside my index page, and again, you don't need to understand what is going on in here. I don't know if I explained that in the previous episode, how to actually create objects. I may have, I don't know. But just know that I created an object based off the class called pet, which means that I can now use the properties and methods inside that object, okay, or inside the class. So what I did is I echoed out the owner method that is inside that specific class called pet, because I did name it owner. If you were to go back in here, you can actually see that's the name of it. And now to show you what exactly happens if I were to echo this out inside the browser, this is what we're going to get. And as you can see, we get an
Sorry, I didn't want him to click all the way, go all the way forward. Okay, there we go. So on line 15 there, I wanted to mention this real quick. What he's doing there is no different than what you've already done, right? Let's use Python as an example. Print student1 dot name or something like that, right? What we're doing in this instance, or if it was like, if there was a thing called like display owner or something like that, right? Then you would just do pet1 dot display owner and the parentheses and the semicolon, right? And we just execute that function. Well, what I wanted to draw your attention to is the fact that here on line 15 where he's doing that, he's echoing out this information, but look what he's doing. He's grabbing the name of the object, which is this $ pet01, and then he's using a dash and a greater than symbol followed by owner parentheses semicolon. Okay, so just don't let that throw you. Just sort of like what he said a second ago. Just it's not super important that you completely understand that. Yes, sir.
What's echo?
Echo. It's the PHP equivalent to print. Right. So if you wanted to print out "Hello World," it would be echo "Hello World." Okay. Let's move along again.
Were to go back in here, you can actually see that's the name of it. And now to show you what exactly happens if I were to echo this out inside the browser, this is what we're going to get. And as you can see, we get an uncaught error. Why is that happening? Well, right now we have something inside our properties and methods that you may have noticed, which is something called private. Now, whenever you create a property or method inside any sort of class, you need to define a visibility for them. Now, right now I've set them to private, all of them, because as a default, you need to always make sure you, first of all, prioritize putting them as private whenever you create any sort of properties and methods. And then you need to think to yourself, do I need to use these pieces of data outside the classes? Because when we set them to private, we can only use the properties and methods inside the same class. So this method down here that I'm echoing from the index page doesn't have the visibility to actually access it since it's set to private. It's only whatever's inside this class here that can actually access it. So like I said, we need to sort of think, do I need to use this method outside the class? In this case here, I do need to use it outside the class because I'm trying to access it from inside my index page. So I do need to have some kind of visibility that allow for me to access it from in here. And we can do that by setting it to public instead. So now if we were to go inside the browser, you can actually see that we now get hi there, because now we set the visibility to the correct one. So we've talked about private and public as visibilities, but we haven't talked about the last one, which is something called protected. So when it comes to private, we can only access the data from inside the class. This means that if I were to actually take this method down here, just copy paste it up inside my person class. Then if I were to take this variable a and instead reference it to some of the data I have inside this person class, so I can actually just go ahead and delete. Now, the way we reference to data inside the same class is using a keyword called variable this, which means that I'm pointing to this class I'm inside of right now. And what I can then do is I can point to a specific property or method using the little arrow here, and I can point to a property called first. Now, do notice that I didn't put a $ in front of the first name because I'm pointing to a property and not a variable. Again, like I said, a property is not the same thing as a variable. We just need to define them with the variable symbol when we create them, but when we reference to them, we don't use the variable symbol. So if I were to do this and then tweak my index page a little bit, so we instead of calling out the pet class, we instead call out the person class, because now we're referencing to the person up here, like so. And if I were to do that, it should now write out my first name. So if we were to go inside the browser, refresh, you can now see it says Daniel. And now you might have a few questions, because why can I print this out inside my browser when the properties are set to private? Let's just go and take a look at what exactly is going on inside the class again. So as you can see, inside this class here, we have some private properties and I have a public method. Now, because private means that I can only access the data from inside the class, if I were to make a public method like this one down here and actually access the property from inside the method, it now means that I can actually access the properties from inside this method here, because this method.
Does that make sense what he's talking about? Okay, so this particular property or variable, however you want to think about it, It's inside of a class, so it's technically property. But anyway, it's got the dollar sign, so it's actually a variable, but whatever. So we have this first name variable property thing here, right? Now, a moment ago, he was trying to, from within his index.php, access something that was private from outside of that class. But what he's doing here is the variable is private, but the function is not. It's public, right? So because it's a part of this class, it has access to all this stuff, right? Because only things inside of a class have inside of that same class have access to private things, right? Does that make sense so far? You understand why this has access to this, right? Because they're part of the same class. Does that make sense? Right? But this function itself is public, which means basically what happens is, then this is where you start getting into protected. It would kind of be like, okay, so like your little brother or a sibling or something can't get information about you from the school, right? That's not legally allowed, right? But your parents can, right? So while your sibling cannot go to the school and ask for that information, they could, in theory, ask your parents for that information. Hey, what grade does Ian have in English or something, right? Like, your sibling could go to your parent and ask that question, right? So while they themselves do not have access to that information, they have access to someone who does. Does that make sense? So while the index.php file that he showed you a moment ago doesn't have access to this information, it knows somebody who does. And so what it says is, hey, what is this thing? And it says, hang on, let me go find out. And it goes and it does that. And then because it's public, it can talk to any other class or page or whatever. Does that make sense? It's not crucial that you 100% get it, but in the general sense, does that kind of seem logical? That the variable itself or the property is private, but the function we're using to get that information is public, which means that we can call this from anywhere, and then it can go get this private information for us. Okay? So wanted to clarify a little bit, because I feel like he was being a little vague there. I just wanted to clarify what he was saying.
It can access the properties, so if I can access the method from the index page, then I can also access the properties from within the method, if that makes sense. So that's why we can actually echo out the data here if they're inside that method. So now let's go ahead and just go back a little bit here. Actually, let's just go ahead and copy paste, because I'm actually going to do something very similar here. So if we were to copy, delete, and paste it inside the class we have done here and just replace it, we're going to talk about the protected visibility. So right now, what we have here, let me actually go and change the inside my index page as well. There we go. So right now what we have here is the same classes that we had as before. We have person and we have pet. Now the pet method is right now still trying to access a property from within the same class. But right now we don't have a property inside this class called first, because that's what I'm trying to access here. So what we can do is we can inherit properties and methods from one class to another class. And we can do that using a very simple keyword. So if we were to go up inside the class name, where we defined the class up here, and say that it extends person, it now means that all the properties and methods within person are now getting inherited into the pet class. This means that...
Okay, so now I'm going to pause here. So what he's talking about, and it's kind of weird that he's using pet and person. What would actually make a whole lot more sense is if he had a class, if this was called person, and the one down here was called student. Okay? Because so think about, we talked about this in database, students will have like a major, right? Like in school, like in college, they have a major, right? Like I'm majoring in history, okay? The janitor probably is not going to have a major. They might if they're also a student, but in generally speaking, they're not going to, right? They're still gonna have a first name and a last name, but they're not gonna have like a major, right? Or like, you know, if we had a Boolean, like, is this person enrolled? We don't need to have that for a maintenance person because unless they're a student, of course they're not enrolled. Same thing with an instructor, right? Instructors have like departments that they might oversee, things like that, right? So if you think about it like that, you might have a class called person that has things like a first name, a last name, a date of birth, a social security number, things that all human beings have, right? Then down here on line 9, you might have a situation like class student extends person. And then you could give student things like is enrolled, major, residence hall, anticipated year of graduation, like all the different things right there that would like be very specific to a student. But it means that you don't then have to go in and say, oh, and also students have a first name, they have a last name, they have a date of birth. And you don't have to repeat any of that stuff. Do you remember that from Python? Remember what I'm talking about? That's what we're doing here, okay? So when I was talking a moment ago, and he'll cover this here in a second, but when I was talking about how protected works, what that means is, even if this is private or there's some other sort of private information here, things in the pet class can access it. Why? Well, if it's protected at least. Why? Because it is derived from the person class. Okay? Again, this will sink in over time. I just wanted to clarify what he's talking about.
That I can now access these different, properties up inside the person class if I were to use the protected keyword. So just to sort of explain this, let's actually go and see what happens right now if I were to refresh the browser. Do notice that these properties are still set to private. So if I were to go inside the browser, just to see we get an error message. And as you can see, we now get a undefined property, which means that it can't find it. So if I were to go back inside my classes here, what I can do is I can go ahead and make my private property up here inside the person class, and I can actually make it protected instead. So by doing this, what I'm now saying is that this property up here can only be accessed from within the same class, just like private. However, if any classes inherits any sort of properties and methods from this class here, we can also use them inside that other class. This means that right now, if I were to actually refresh the browser, I can access this data from within the other class and still print out the data. And I hope that sort of makes sense to you, because protected is one of those sort of visibilities that confuse a lot of people. So just know, if you have protected data, then you can only access the data from within the same class or any class that extends to it, okay? So right now, this class down here has access to all the properties and methods from within its own class and this class up here. I should also mention that right down here, when we do actually gain access to the property from within the other class, I'm referencing to that specific property as variable this, which I said before was when you reference to something within the same class. But because we right now extend to that specific class up there, you should kind of see them as the same class now. So they're sort of like an extension of one another. So we can still use the variable this keyword in order to access properties from within the other class as well.
One other thing that I feel like I should bring up, what might be a situation where you could use protected to your advantage? Why might you want a situation where you can access something both within the same class and also within a child class? What might be a situation where you could do something like that? Any ideas? What if I wanted to create admins or something, and I wanted them to have access to things that other users don't have access to, right? I would want them to be able to access it, but I wouldn't want it to be public, right? So protected would be the way to go. Does that make sense? Why? Awesome.
Now, just the last thing, just to properly demonstrate this, I just want to go ahead and go inside my index page. And what I want to do is I want to gain access to my person class. And instead of trying to print out a method, I'm just simply going to print out the property called first, like so, which means that if I were to go back inside my class, set this one to private, we are now trying to access this private property from within the person class. So if we were to refresh the browser, you can see that we right now get an uncaught error because right now we're trying to access a private property. So if we were to go back inside the class, change it to protected, what do you think is going to happen? Because remember, we can only access this data from within the same class or within any classes that extends to it. Does that mean we can access it from the index page? No, it does not. So if we were to refresh, you can see we can still not access it because it's protected. I would need to create a method from within the same class or the other class down here that then accesses this specific property and prints it out or echoes it out inside the browser. If I were to set it to public, however, and then go inside the browser again, you can now see that we can access the data because it's set to public. So that's what I want to talk about when it comes to visibility and when it comes to...
Okay, so remember what he said right there at the end. He would have to create a method that has access to it, right? In other words, I know a guy, right? That kind of scenario. It's like I can't get that information directly, but I know a guy that knows a guy, right? So like they can get that information for me. Kind of a weird example, but I think that covers it. Okay, final thing today, properties and methods. Now he's talked about that quite a bit in the previous video, but this is actually going to focus solely on these things. Just as a bit of advice, I am going to have you do what he's been doing. So it might behoove you to follow along. That way that whenever time comes, you have significantly less work to do. Okay, so let's hop over and watch this final video.
Last episode, you learned how to create classes inside object-oriented PHP, and in this episode, we're going to learn about something called properties and methods when it comes to PHP. So as you can see in front of me here, I have a basic index page. There's nothing really exciting going on in here, besides maybe a couple of PHP tags we're going to use for something a little bit later on. Other than that, I have a person.inc.php file, which is where we're going to create our class, and in this case, I created a class called person. So what we're going to be doing here is we're going to talk about these properties and methods and what exactly they are and how we actually use them when it comes to PHP. So when it comes to using classes inside PHP, the thing that we use it for is to create something called objects, or at least that's one of the purposes behind creating classes. Another purpose is that we have a way to categorize our code inside our project. So any sort of methods or properties that I have that is regarding a person, I can put all of that inside a class called person. So we have it categorized inside one place. So what we can do with these classes here is that they function as a type of blueprint or a template. And based off this template, we can create many different copies of this class. So we can create an object that has all the properties and methods of the class that is just a separate object. To give an example here, let's go and go inside the index page. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a couple of different variables. I'm going to say we have a variable that is called name. I'm going to set this one equal to Daniel. Then I'm going to set something called AI color, just to have something. I'm going to set this one equal to blue, because my eyes are blue. And then we're going to go ahead and set an age. So we're going to say age is equal to 28. So now we have a couple of different variables, and this could be properties of a specific person. We maybe have some functions that could be regarding this person, so we could have a function that goes in and updates the age after a year has passed. So we can do a couple of different things with this person. However, if I were to go down and say, well, I have this other person called, I don't know, Timmy, and I need to copy paste the same variables again, because now we need to have two people. And suddenly now we have to give this guy a number as 1, because we need to have multiple people, so we gotta somehow categorize these different names and properties. So we're gonna go and name these ones 2. And now we start to make things a little bit messy, because now things are not making sense. And do bear in mind, if I want to use this code, right now I'm using it inside my index page. We could of course put it inside a separate document and then link to that document on all the pages, but it just kind of makes sense that we want to categorize these under a specific class, so we don't have to repeat our code again and again and again. Therefore, when it comes to creating classes, we can instead create something called an object. And this is something we can just instantiate and then use on the go whenever we need to create a new person, which is kind of handy. So now if we were to go inside our class called person, and I should probably mention that I am using Atom as a text editor because I know I'll get questions about that in the comments, since this is not the one I used in some of the older tutorials in this course here. I did used to use Sublime Text. This is the one called Atom, A-T-O-M. Okay, so inside this document here we have our class called person. And what we can do inside this class is we can create a bunch of different properties and a bunch of different methods, which kind of works like variables and functions, but not really, because we're talking about properties and methods that are part of a class, which will become part of an object once we actually create that object. So not really the same thing as variables and functions, but if you don't have any experience when it comes to classes, that's the closest thing I can sort of relate it to if you have to understand it. Inside this class here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start creating some properties. So just going to make a comment. Properties. And then I'm going to go ahead and create a property, which could be a public, because we talked about scopes at one point. We're going to create a public property, and I'm going to call this one name. Now, as you can see, I only declared this property inside the class. I didn't actually assign anything to it. And that's because one of the functionalities that classes has when we want to create an object is that we can assign values to these properties when we create the objects. So simply declaring the properties is something that you should get used to doing when you want to have some data that will change depending on which person we're creating or which object we're creating based off this class here. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a declared property without assigning anything to it. And if it doesn't make sense now, it will make sense a little bit later. So just stick with me and then you'll actually see what I mean there. So what we can do is we can also go ahead and create a property called iColor. We can create one called age. And that's pretty much it. So now that we have these properties, let's go ahead and create a method, because that would kind of make sense that since we're talking about properties and methods, why not create a method there? So we're going to go ahead and create a method, and we're going to call this one a public function, and then we need to give it some kind of name. We could actually go ahead and set one of the values for one of these properties up here, just for fun for now. I know I said that when we create the class, we need to create the variable, or not the variables, but the values for these different properties. But just for fun for now, let's just go ahead and create some of the values for these properties using a method, just for fun. So inside this function here, I'm going to go ahead and set it to, or call it some kind of name. I'm going to call it set name, just to set some kind of name up there, parentheses and curly brackets. So in here, what I can do in order to point to one of the properties I have inside the class here is I can actually go and use a variable this keyword, which points to this specific class we're inside of right now. And I can then use this arrow, which is a dash and an arrow. Now I'm actually in doubt. Is it called a dash in English? I'm not quite sure that. You might correct me in the comments or something, but that little line that connects two words together, that's the one you gotta use. So a dash greater than, and then you need to refer to the property that we have up inside our class. Now when we do this, we don't actually write variable name like so. We actually just write name, because variable name is already a property inside the class, and the name for this property is name, not the $ in front of it. So we just need to refer to the name, not variable name. Then what we can do here is we can actually go ahead and set it equal to variable name. And now you might get confused, because all I'm doing here, I could set this one to, let's say, new name or something. It doesn't have to be the same variable, but what I'm essentially doing here is I'm just going to grab a new piece of data by passing it in inside the method here. So when I actually use this method inside my code, inside the index page, I'm just simply going to pass in a name inside the method parameters, and then it's going to assign itself to this property inside the class. That's essentially what we're doing here. So what I could do is I could actually also go and do this, if that makes more sense. But essentially we're just passing in the data from the method here. So what I can do now is I can go inside my index page. And in order to use this class inside our document here, we actually need to instantiate the class first. Now, when we create any sort of object from a class, we need to allocate memory for that specific object. And we do that using a keyword called new. So if I were to go in here, first of all, we need to actually create the object before we can use anything inside the class. So I'm just going to go and create a variable. I'm going to call this one person1 because we're just creating a new person here. And I'm going to set it equal to new and then the name of the class, which is person. And now you can actually choose, at least as it is right now, whether or not you just want to close it off or if you want to use parentheses. I recommend always using parentheses because we will talk about something called constructors at one point, which will require that you use parentheses because we need to pass in parameters. This is previously when I talked about that when we create an object, we set the properties. This is what I'm talking about using constructors. So just make it a habit to use parentheses, but you can do it without if you want to, but make it a habit. So going below here, what we're going to do is I'm going to take this new object that I just created called person1, and I'm going to access one of the methods from inside it because I need to set a name property in here. Actually, before we use the method, let's actually go ahead and just echo out the name property from inside the class. So if I were to go ahead and say we want to echo $person1, which is the object we just created, and I want to link to the property, so we're going to point to, and we have to do this whether we link to a method or a property. We have to use this little arrow here. And I'm going to go ahead and point to a property called name. Notice that I'm not using the $, because like I said, we're talking about a property, not a variable. So we just need to write name inside what we have here. Now, before we can do anything inside the browser, we do need to link to our class file, because right now it's just going to give us an error if we were to go inside the browser and refresh. So we need to go ahead and link to our class file, which is inside a includes folder. So I'm going to say includes / and I'm going to go ahead and say person.inc.php. So if we were to go inside the browser now and refresh, you can see we get nothing inside the browser. And that's because we haven't actually set the property inside this object we just created. So if I were to go ahead and say that we want to use our set name method right before we do this, I can actually go ahead and say, well, let's just go ahead and run the method called set name parentheses. And then we need to pass in the name that we want to set to the property called name. So in here, I'm just going to go ahead and write Daniel. Save it, go inside my browser, refresh. And as you can see, if I were to zoom in a little bit, we now have Daniel, because Daniel is now set equal to the property called name inside our object here. Not inside the class, but inside the object that is a copy of that specific class. So with this said, let's actually go and create another object, because like I said, a class is a template and we can create as many objects as we want from this class. So if we were to go and say, I want to create person2 in this case here, I'm just going to go ahead and instantiate the class one more time. So we're going to say we have a class called person parentheses, and then below here I'm just going to go ahead and set a new name for this class. Actually, let's go ahead and echo out the property called name, because what do you think this is going to end up being? Of course, we need to change that to 2. When I echo this out inside the browser, you might think, is it going to say Daniel or is it going to say nothing? Because if I were to go ahead and do this, let's just go ahead and delete that previous echo, otherwise we will get Daniel inside the browser. If I were to go inside the browser, refresh, you can see, we're not getting anything. But that's because right now we created a second object and we haven't set a value for the second object. Daniel is part of the first object, not the second one. So what I can do here is I can go ahead and run this method again right before we echo it out. Of course, I'm going to refer to the second object, and I'm going to go ahead and set the name to something like Timmy. Then if we were to echo out the name, you can see we get Timmy. Let's just go ahead and echo out both of them just to see both names inside the browser. So let's echo out object number 1 and object number 2, at least the name property from them. And as you can see, we get Daniel and Timmy. So now with these objects created, the property inside these objects will now be Daniel and Timmy. And we have actually set those values. So what I need to do later on, if I have to create a, let's say I have to use these properties for some other method I create inside this object, I don't have to set the properties again because they are saved now forever as Daniel and Timmy with these two objects here. So unless I destroy the object, they're not going to change. And that's kind of the cool thing when it comes to creating objects from classes when it comes to object-oriented PHP. So with this said, I don't think there's anything else I want to teach you for now when it comes to simply creating objects and creating properties and methods. But in the next episode, we're going to get more into these constructors and destructors that I talked about that were pretty much an essential part of creating classes when we want to fill in values inside these properties we have inside the class. So in the next episode, we're going to talk about constructors and destructors. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you in the next one.
Okay, so we sort of started on this last week or the week before, where we're talking about a form to add restaurants, a form to add users, and stuff like that written in PHP. Now, as far as mobile app goes and web dev and all that stuff, we're going to use Node.js, obviously, because we can't use PHP inside Xamarin or inside of Cordova. But what we're going to need for the back end, if you will, we're going to need some forms and other PHP documents that deal with users. Okay, so this should give you these videos should give you a pretty good idea of like where you need to go with this. Okay, so here in a minute I'll send you on break. You come back, and then I will have an assignment already up on Canvas for you when you get back. Basically, you're doing exactly what he just did. I'm just going to have you create a couple of different people and echo out their names on different lines. Okay. Does anybody remember how to do it? How to do a line break in HTML? Anybody remember? Yeah. Very good. Excellent. So if you need to look up how to do that, how to implement BR, as Ryan just so accurately stated, then you might want to hop on W3 Schools and check that out, just so that you are as up to date on the info as he is, so you'll be able to implement that in your project. Are there any questions, concerns, comments, thoughts, ideas? Okay, come back at come back at 10 minutes to 1, so 12:50, and we will start working on this project.